Hello everyone, I'm Brad from Make It, and today I will be making this lift-up top coffee table using reclaimed pallet wood and epoxy inlay. Let's get started. I started this project by building the cabinet portion of this coffee table. I used my table saw and miter saw to cut my 3/4 inch sanded plywood down to size. For assembling the sides together, I drilled screws directly into the sides. These screws will be covered up by the legs of the coffee table, so it doesn't matter that they are exposed. I like to use clamps when screwing my sides together to help prevent the boards from moving on me. The cabinet part is divided into two areas. One side is for the tabletop lift area, and the other side will have two openings for storing remotes and smaller objects. Once all my sides were assembled, I used my router with a rabbiting bit to make a groove along the bottom side of the tabletop lift area so I can attach the bottom panel. I did this in two shallow passes to prevent tear out of the plywood. However, I should have made this groove in 3 passes because I still ended up getting a little tear out. I cut my bottom panel off camera and the corners of the panel didn't line up with the groove that I just cut out with my router. I could use a chisel to square up the groove, or you can just round off the corners of the panel using a sander, which I find it easier for me. Next, I marked the locations of the 2 openings on the side of the coffee table. I drilled 2 holes in the opposite corners of the openings and cut them out using a jigsaw. This won't give you a perfect straight line, so to help prevent the edges, I glued sandpaper to a piece of board and went to town. It seemed to work pretty well. I noticed there was a lot of flex on the sides, so to give it more strength, I added an extra support in the middle of the tabletop lift side, but I had to remove the middle board in order to screw the support board in place. I made sure to stay above my bottom panel groove and made it square with the sides. Next, I added the inside compartments of the 2 side openings. I used more 3/4 inch plywood for this because it will also add to the strength of the cabinet portion of the coffee table. For the coffee table top, I began by cutting out my 3/4 inch plywood sheet down to rough dimension. I could then start laying out where I wanted each piece of pallet wood to be placed. Pallet wood has all kinds of defects and cracks. I wanted to embrace those defects into my tabletop so I could then fill the cracks and holes with epoxy later on. I cut 1 row at a time and then ripped them through my table saw at various widths. For those of you who are new to this channel, I have been remaking a lot of the furniture in my house, and I have been using this similar pallet wood style for each piece of furniture. So if you like this project, then I would like to encourage you to check them out as well. I'll leave a link at the end of this video. Once everything was cut out, I sanded the boards down using 80 grit sandpaper before running them through my planer to get them to the same thickness. I get a lot of questions as to why I sand the pallet wood before running them through my planer. The reason is because pallet wood has a lot of dirt and grime on the surface of the boards, which can dull your planer blades pretty quickly. So by sanding them with 80 grit sandpaper, I can extend the life of my blades. Next, I glued the pallet wood to the plywood. I used brad nails to hold the boards in place until I could clamp everything down. As the tabletop glue dried, I could start on the legs. I traced and rough cut a simple pattern of 3/4 inch plywood with my jigsaw. I wanted these legs to be slightly angled, so I eyeballed the angle to what I thought looked good and then marked the top. I sanded the top using my oscillating belt sander. I then used an angle finder to determine the angle I needed for the bottom of the table leg, which I could then sand down as well. I took the plywood leg cutout and used that to trace and cut out 3 more plywood legs as well as 8 more pallet wood cutouts. Next, I sandwiched the plywood cutout with 2 pallet wood cutouts. I used brad nails to help prevent the pieces from sliding around when trying to clamp everything together. The next day when the glue dried, I flushed up the sides of the legs using my oscillating belt sander again. I made sure to keep my angle finder at the same angle so I can use that as a reference during the sanding process. Now that the tabletop had a chance to dry, I could start prepping it for epoxy. I started with punching the brad nails further down into the wood. I will be running the tabletop through my planer after the epoxy dries, and I definitely don't want these brad nails to be hitting my planer blades. Next, I cleaned up the edges of the top with my router using a flush trim bit, which allows me to flush the plywood edges to the plywood edge. I then apply aluminum tape to the edges and any other possible spillover spots that the epoxy could leak out of. I gotta say, this aluminum tape worked pretty well. For the epoxy, I'm using Total Boat 2-in-1 High Performance Epoxy with slow hardener. I made sure to mix the epoxy and hardener very thoroughly before adding a white pigment powder specifically for epoxy. Next, I could start pouring the epoxy into all the cracks and holes on the tabletop. It was hard to gauge how much epoxy I needed, and I completely underestimated how much epoxy I needed. Using the slow hardener gave me plenty of time to make another batch to finish filling the rest of the tabletop. I noticed there was some rather large cracks in the coffee table legs, so I decided to fill those with epoxy as well. When I was done pouring the epoxy, I went over everything with a heat gun to remove any air bubbles that were in the epoxy. I let the epoxy cure for 3 days. I needed to flatten the tabletop using my planer. However, this top was much too wide for my planer. So I cut the tabletop into 3 sections using my table saw. One section is the width of the stationary side of the tabletop, and the other 2 sections are for the lift top side. I then ran the boards through the planer enough times just to get rid of all the epoxy overfill sections. I could then glue the 2 tabletop lift sections back together. After that had a chance to dry, I went ahead and clamped the other section of the tabletop to the piece I just glued up and cleaned up both edges of the tabletop with my circular saw and a straight edge. Next, I was able to glue and nail the trim along the edges of the tabletop. I couldn't run the table legs through the planer, and I used way too much epoxy on the legs. So I used my heat gun to warm the epoxy up just a little bit, which allowed me to scrape off the excess epoxy using an old chisel, and this worked really well. Now it was time to start prepping everything for the finish and paint. I used wood filler for all the screw holes and any exposed plywood end grain. I sanded everything down using 80, 120, and 220 grit sandpaper. But for the epoxies, I wanted a little more polish to it, so I sanded the epoxy sections using 1000, 1500, and 2000 grit sandpaper. For the tabletop finish, I put on 3 coats of water-based polycrylic. I use this finish because it keeps the natural color of the wood pretty well, and it matches what I used from my previous projects. I attached the bottom panel of the tabletop lift storage area using wood glue and brad nails. I won't be storing anything heavy in the storage area, so it should be plenty strong for my needs. For the inside storage area, I stained using an early American color, and for the contrast, I painted the outside cabinet portion white. After everything had a chance to dry, I could attach the legs. I used 1 clamp and 1 screw to attach all 4 legs. This allowed me to stand the coffee table upright on my bench, which I knew was level and flat. By leaving 1 screw in each leg, I could then adjust the legs until the coffee table was completely level. With the coffee table level, I could then finish screwing in the legs. Next, I installed the tabletop lift hinges. I started by securing the hinges to the underside of the tabletop first. I'll leave a link in the description to the tabletop lift hinges I used. With the hinges secured to the underside of the tabletop, I could then mount the hinges in the cabinet portion of the coffee table. I used clamps to help secure the tabletop in place while I could screw down the hinges into the storage area. For the stationary side of the coffee table, I used these L brackets to secure the top to the coffee table. For the 2 openings on the side of the coffee table, I cut out 2 covers off camera. I then used my angle finder to find the angle of the inside legs. I used that angle and marked it on my covers, which I cut out with my miter saw. I wasn't quite sure how I wanted to secure the cover to the openings, and I didn't want to use much hardware for this coffee table. So I decided to use rare earth magnets to attach the two covers. I marked and drilled 2 holes where the magnets needed to be fit, and then did the same process with the back of the covers. I used CA glue to secure the magnets in place, and I think it worked just fine. This next part is completely optional. I like to have an open shelf on the bottom, which gives me more space to put books or magazines. I ripped down a 2x4 to make 1/2 inch thick slats. I took all my slats and made a reference line so I knew how far they needed to stick out from my support board. I then attached the slats to the support board using brad nails and a spacer to make my gaps even. To prevent the slats from sagging, I added a middle support board as well as glued a mini leg in the middle. I gave everything a quick sand before painting the shelf white. To attach the shelf to the coffee table, I used more L brackets and screwed them to the sides of each leg. And this coffee table is done. Thank you all for sticking around and watching this video. I would love to hear your comments on whether you would include the bottom shelf or not. If you like this video, then hit the thumbs up button. If you want to see more DIY videos like this, then subscribe. That's all for this one, and I'll catch you on the next one. Bye.